Hello and welcome back to those that have been here before, and if you haven't, then my name is Patrice and this is Hort Gothic, where we talk about all things strange, spooky, unusual, horror movies, and today, vampires. One of my faves. Can we ever get over vampires? I think not. This is specifically looking at how the vampire went from the monster of Nosferatu and things like that to a lover and everybody wanting a vampire boyfriend or girlfriend, depending on how you look at it. So I want you to take a couple of seconds, close your eyes and picture a vampire. What do you see? Do you see the terrifying creature that's stalking its victim through the night, lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce and drain its victim? Or do you see the mysterious, ridiculously attractive, immortal being with perfect hair and centuries of emotional baggage? I suppose it really does depend on when you grew up. Now you're going to see the writer come out in me today, as unlike my other videos, I wrote a very detailed script for this one, as of course it is a topic that's close to my stone cold heart. So come, let's explore. Over the last 100 years, vampires have undergone one of the most dramatic transformations in pop culture, so from books, film, TV programs. They began as this grotesque symbol of death, disease, for example, because at that time, when they first began, they were there to represent unknown diseases and illnesses that killed people that they didn't know why. They didn't know why these people were dying. And a lot of the time on birth certificates, you would see they would just put consumption because they didn't know what illness it was until it was eventually discovered. From that, though, they then evolved into this kind of sophisticated aristocrat, that had lots of money and was, usually from Europe somewhere. And somehow from death and disease to money and mystery. And eventually became some sort of very, romanticized character in, modern entertainment, for example. But of course, we have to take a look at how did that happen. So the evolution of vampire in film and why audiences stopped fearing them and started falling in love with them. And if you're anything like me, there was a transition from obviously as a child being terrified of vampires and then of course wanting to be one, right? I am unfortunately in that circle, yeah. So before we get into movies, it's worth mentioning the vampire legends of course existed in cinema existed long before cinema. Various cultures around the world told stories of the undead creatures, and this was in pretty much every culture you can think of. There will be some story of an undead creature like a vampire draining somebody's essence, or soul, or essence. So this undead creature that fed on the living was obviously what people told others to beware of, and I think a lot of it came from not going out at night, because these creatures seem to always come out at night, and that would be the fear of darkness, because the legends, these began before people had electricity, before people could easily go out in well-lit areas, and the darkness held secrets and dangers and a lot of fears that were unknown. So I go into this in a lot more detail in one of my previous videos, if you scroll down, and it's about the Strigoi, and it starts off with that and then goes into how the Strigoi legend became what we know as the vampire today. So these beings were usually terrifying. They weren't these handsome nobles living in a grand castle. They were usually like bloated corpses or monsters, or, often also spirits, associated with disease, misfortune, and of course death. The modern vampire, however, owes much of its identity to Bram Stoker. So Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. Stoker combined older folklore with Victorian fears surrounding sexuality, foreign influence, disease, and social change. His Count Dracula was frightening, but he was also extremely charismatic. This combination would become incredibly important later on when we talk about today's vampire. When the film arrived, the monster side of the vampire took center stage. In 1922, audiences were introduced to, as I earlier mentioned, Nosferatu, which, for me, I find quite comedic to watch now, but I can imagine back then it was quite terrifying. So some people, though, even today, find Count Orlock, who was, Nosferatu, quite disturbing. And he's still seen as one of the most disturbing vampires on screen. He was this like bald, almost rat-like looking creature. His teeth were kind of like right at the front, not what we see with the vampires that became popular. And he looked, of course, very unnatural, very supernatural. Everything about him very much screamed plague and death, dying. That's exactly what he looked like. This wasn't a creature anyone wanted to date. Well, somebody might. There'll probably be somebody out there. Who knows? But the timing was important. As I mentioned before, Europe was still recovering from World War One and the devastating influenza pandemic, which was, of course, huge for that time. Fear, uncertainty, that all filled everyday life. People woke up to it, went to sleep with it. They didn't know what was going to come the next day. Nobody did. And horror films reflected those anxieties. The vampire represented a contamination, death, and the unknown. For decades, this remained largely unchanged, and then a major turning point. So in 1931, Bela Lugosi played Dracula in Universal's Dracula. Suddenly, the vampire wasn't just frightening, he was elegant. He wore fine clothes, spoke with confidence, and possessed a strange magnetism. While audiences still viewed Dracula as the villain, they were also fascinated by him and definitely wanted to learn more. Lugosi's performance created the blueprint that would influence vampire portrayals for generations. The vampire had become both predator and performer. As the decades passed, filmmakers began emphasizing the vampire's sophistication and sexuality. So that look that he had, with the cape and the elegant dress and, the jewels. And I mean, I naturally have a widow's peak. It was more pronounced as well when I was a kid. So I was pretty much a vampire every year, but in a bin liner, wrapped around my waist then with another piece of bin liner and white face paint and the fake plastic fangs from the joke store. It was excellent. Went trick-or-treating that. I mean, we weren't rich. So the vampire was no longer simply a monster hiding in the dark. He became an outsider looking in. Immortal, lonely, intelligent, and tragic. By the 1950s and 60s, the films produced by Hammer Studios, so your Hammer Horrors, they pushed this even further. Christopher Lee's Dracula was physically imposing, intensely charismatic, and undeniably seductive. The horror remained, but sexuality became impossible to ignore, and this wasn't accidental. Many scholars point out that vampire stories have always contained themes of temptation, forbidden desire, and intimacy. The act of feeding itself carries obvious symbolic undertones. And I've often thought about that. Some people may not see it as a sensual thing, but like I said before, the taking of one's essence and the act of a lot of vampires, that aren't depicted as monsters, it is quite intimate, seductive, and something that a lot of people want to replicate. I mean, I remember when Angelina Jolie was with Billy Bob Thornton and they were very proudly walking down some red carpet for something with vials of each other's blood around their neck, and it was a huge scandal at the time. Now it's like, meh, okay, well, I don't really care about it, to be honest, but But social attitudes towards sexuality became more open, and filmmakers felt increasingly comfortable exploring those themes directly, and gave them a license to, so they did. The vampire became a safe way to discuss desires that society felt uncomfortable to discuss. Then came the late 20th century, and everything changed. So where these things changed, instead of focusing on the victims being like the main character, the vampire became the protagonist. And that was where they sat down and they thought, what would that look like? And this is kind of what I grew up with, is seeing the vampire as the protagonist, scary or not. So one of the most influential examples, and this is in my opinion, and I very much believe this in cinema, and obviously it was based on the book, is, the 1994 Interview with the Vampire. One of my favourite movies in general, let alone favourite vampire movies. I think it is brilliantly done. I'm not a fan of Tom Cruise, but I think that's like his best role. I genuinely do. And, obviously Brad Pitt was excellent, and so was Kirsten Dunst, and she was so young, but she played the role so well. And And I remember when it came out, I was too young to watch it, way too young, you know, and this was when films were in the cinema for like 25 years. And when it eventually came out on VHS or able to even rent before you could buy, right? You know, it would take like 2 years. It took so long. So actually, it wasn't until adulthood that I eventually sat down and watched this movie. And of course, thoroughly enjoyed it. But I do remember watching the trailer as a kid, and I think I must have been only 7 or 8. And I was at my cousin's house having a sleepover, and we were watching TV past what is called Watershed over here, right? So 9 p.m. and it's when kids should be not watching TV, right? And we saw the trailer, and she didn't really pay attention to it at the time. I think she was reading something, but I saw it and it really stuck in my mind. Like I was like, had this deep fear. And I remember what's so ridiculous is that my hair is not as long now, but it used to be down to my waist, and I would wrap my hair around my neck when I went to sleep as if it was some form of protection from a vampire. But yeah, that's the kind of kid I was. Not that normal, no. So, you know, Interview with the Vampire though did something very different. You know, because perhaps, I guess, for the first time in mainstream cinema, audiences were invited to sympathise with the vampire, to see them as more than just a fearful creature. These characters struggled with guilt, loneliness, grief, morality, identity. They weren't monsters, or at least they weren't only monsters. There was more to them than that. They were also seen and were, I guess, deeply human. This shift reflected broader changes happening in storytelling. Audiences increasingly wanted complex characters rather than purely the good heroes and the bad villain. They wanted the anti-hero. And I'm a big fan of an anti-hero and, you know, good, you know, that kind of good chaotic. And the vampire was perfect for this. After all, what could be more complicated than a creature that survives by harming others but still longs for connection and redemption? You just think about that for a moment. Like it's complicated, and it makes you sympathise with them, even though they are doing terrible things. By the early 2000s, the transformation was nearly complete. And again, one of my favourites of all time, shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So then we had, of course, the Vampire Diaries, and of course, Twilight turned vampires into romantic leads. Buffy introduced so much to me when I watched it a bit later than when it came out in 1997. I wasn't like kind of old enough to really watch it then, but it introduced the idea of vampires being seen as romantic and seductive, as well as fearful creatures, you know, when they changed into their kind of vampire look. At this stage, though, I haven't yet seen Interview with the Vampire. I saw Buffy first, right? And I'm such a big fan of Buffy. One of my cats is called Buffy. That is her name. So the focus shifted from horror to relationships. Instead of asking, how do we survive the vampire? We began asking, how do I get a vampire boyfriend? For some horror fans, this was practically sacrilege. They did not like this. It was like, no, the vampire is the villain. He's scary. They are creatures of the night. But it wasn't random, and modern audiences often connected with the story of them being outsiders searching for connection. And also acceptance. I think a lot of people could relate to that, and the vampire embodies that perfectly. They live forever, but rarely belong. You know, immortality and looking beautiful and fabulous forever sounds great, but then you're like, who would you be with? And where would you belong? You'd constantly be having to do that. They're so powerful, yet so isolated. They crave connection, but fear hurting the people they love. In more ways, modern vampire stories became less about the blood and more about identity. Another reason vampires became more attractive is surprisingly simple. Fear changes over time. In the early 20th century, people feared disease, death, and social collapse. Monstrous vampires reflected the fears of the time, of society. Today, audiences are more interested in questions of belonging, loneliness, mental health, and personal identity. As society changed, the vampire changed with it. The creature evolved to reflect our newest anxieties and desires. What's fascinating is that both versions still exist. We still get the terrifying vampires, like those are seen in modern horror films, like, for example, 40 Days of Night, right? So that's a brilliant horror movie. When I remember the first time I watched that, it actually creeped me out. And I've watched a lot of horror, but that creeped me out. And I remember thinking, wow, they really made the vampire something else. And it reminded me of the traditional Strigoi, which I hadn't yet seen in film when it came to the vampire. And they had their own language, they had their own way of communicating, and they were extremely clever and fast. And, the ending, of course, I'm not going to ruin it for anybody, but it's got everything in it. It's got everything in it, but most definitely terrifying. Great horror movie though. Actually, about to watch it later, to be honest. It's definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it. It's very polar opposite from the beautiful, sophisticated, seductive vampires. Very not that. If you're looking for that, very not that. No. But at the same time, we continue getting the sympathetic, romantic, and morally conflicted vampires as well. The vampire remains one of the most adaptable monsters ever created because it can become whatever a generation needs it to be. A monster, a villain, a tragic hero, a romantic fantasy, or sometimes all four at the same time. And perhaps that's why vampires have survived for so long, while many other monsters kind of fade into obscurity and, aren't as popular. They're not really about blood, but they're about us. Our fears, our desires, and the things that keep changing as society changes with them. I believe that Interview the Vampire is one of the biggest turning points, as I mentioned before. What's interesting is that Anne Rice, who wrote the book, didn't just make vampires attractive, she made them emotionally compelling. Before Louis and Lestat, vampires were often seen as purely the villains, the monsters, cautionary tales, creatures of the night, horrifying. But Anne Rice she kind of asked a different question. What would it actually feel like to live forever? As I mentioned before, what would that feel like? Again, which is the question that Christian Slater's character really doesn't seem to get. And obviously, if you haven't seen it, I won't spoil it, but he really does not grasp that concept of what it would be like to really be immortal. Suddenly vampires simply weren't frightening, horrifying creatures lurking in the dark that can unalive you. They were fascinating, mysterious, and they were fascinating because they were wrestling with multiple emotions and feelings that human beings do too. Grief, loneliness, identity, morality, love, and for them, what their purpose is and what all of it means over centuries. That's a much deeper hook than simply creature that drinks blood. Then you can almost trace a line through the kind of vampire media, which is Interview the Vampire. So you've got the novel that came out in 1976 by Anne Rice, and then you've got the 1994 film where vampires became tragic, seductive, philosophical beings. And then we have in 1997 Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So vampires are monsters, but they can also be heroes, they can also be gentle, they can also be lovers, and of course anti-heroes. Then True Blood in 2008. Vampires become openly sexual and political. There's a lot of politics in it. And they are integrated into society with humans. Vampire Diaries 2009, this is very much where they're seen as the romantic lead, not just protagonist, but there's a lot of romance and objects of fantasy and desire. And Twilight, of course, there's this series that goes on with the books and the movies from 2008 onwards, and vampires become a mainstream romantic phenomenon. It's seen as very, very common, and like I said, depending on when you were born, some people never see the vampire as something frightening. But what I do find particularly fascinating is that Lestat, Spike, Damon, and Eric Northman all share the kind of same blueprint DNA, if you will. They're morally questionable, charismatic, seductive, dangerous, and wounded. And that speaks to people. It draws people in. And often that's a lot more interesting to people than the traditionally good characters that they are, playing alongside. Lestat especially, I believe, created that template that continues to reoccur. The beautiful immortal who is predator, lover, villain, and tragic figure combined in one. You can see reminiscence of him in characters like Spike, like Damon, and like Eric Northman. True Blood deserves special mention. It definitely does, because when I watched that, I was like, huh? It changed things massively. It was like, oh, you want to see seduction? That's not seduction. I'll show you seduction. And it took that from 0 to 100. The series basically also asked, what if vampires came out of the coffin and had civil rights? What if they integrated with society and weren't hiding anymore? It mixed horror, politics, romance, and sexuality in a way that made vampires feel simultaneously terrifying and irresistible. Then the Vampire Diaries came along and gave us the Salvatore brothers. By that time, the question wasn't, how do we defeat the vampire? It was, which vampire boyfriend should I choose? Team Stefan or Team Damon became a genuine cultural debate. Not for me, but I know it was huge for a lot of people, and still is. It was kind of funny when you look at the progression and the change over time. So 1922, we're very much, run, the vampire's coming, save yourself. And then 1994, I feel bad for the vampire. 2009, I know I can fix him. 2010, which vampire boyfriend do I want this week? The pendulum has swung so far that modern creators sometimes deliberately make vampires scary to kind of surprise the audience or the reader. That's why recent films show often alternative, and they alternate between seductive immortals and genuinely horrifying predators. Slight technical difficulty there. I know I may look a little bit different, probably because it's a different day. Anyway, never mind. One transforms. Let us continue. I feel if someone was to make a documentary about why vampires became these attractive beings, I'd argue that the central figure wasn't Dracula, wasn't Edward Cullen, Damon Salvatore, Eric Northman, or even Spike. Hear me out. I know everyone is going to have their own opinion, but listen to mine for a moment. You may disagree, but this is my opinion. I believe it is the Lestat de Lion-Court. Because once audiences fell in love with Lestat, even while we recognised that he was manipulative, he was deceitful, he was selfish and dangerous and narcissistic, the vampire stopped being simply monster. He became a character people wanted to know more about, spend time with, a character that people wanted to be with. And once that happened, there really was no going back. Interview with a Vampire is the true turning point for me. It shows an insight that I feel before that didn't really come along, and paved the way for people to then point to future movies and books and so on, like Twilight. And Twilight, I understand it sticks out so much in people's minds because it crosses generations and it was such a cultural phenomenon. But by the time Edward Cullen had arrived, the groundwork had already been set by Anne Rice in writing, Into the Vampire decades earlier. Louis and Lestat linger in people's minds. They stay there, and their relationship does. I know there was a TV series, I couldn't get into it, so I am referring very much to the book and then the adaptation in 1994. So the way those characters were portrayed were not just vampires. They're deeply human characteristics, especially with Louis, and the way they dealt with their emotions was very palpable and very human. That's why readers and viewers keep returning to them time and time again. I know I've watched that movie countless times. Their story isn't really about blood and immortality. It's about love, relationship, loneliness, grief, identity, and the search for meaning, especially with Louis, the search for meaning when it comes to living forever and what they are and why they are. And honestly, there's something wonderfully Gothic about being drawn to vampires. I think there's no denying that the idea of vampiric lives and Gothic nature and goths kind of go hand in hand for many of us. They sit at the intersection of horror and romance, tragedy, fantasy, love. And few creatures can be quite so terrifying and beautifully monstrous and sophisticated at the same time. It also makes perfect sense that being someone, like me and many others that loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer and really enjoyed that series that was on TV and, enjoyed the characters, would later then go on to fall in love with Interview with the Vampire. If, like me, you kind of watched it in that order, you may have watched it in a different order, but, who knows. But Buffy opens the door by asking whether monsters can be redeemed. And that was very much the case with her beloved Angel and whether he could get his soul back and so on and so forth. But Interview the Vampire walks straight through that door and asks whether a monster was ever really truly a monster in the first place. There's a moment in Interview with the Vampire where Lestat can read minds, and he says to Louis, because he likes to play with the aristocrats, and he said, well, that woman over there, she got her young lover to her husband so that they could be together and have his money. And Louis is like, how do you know? And Lestat says, I read her mind, read her mind. Louis cannot. And then Lestat says, well, the dark gift is different for all of us. But he goes on to say that's what she did, and they blamed it on a slave, because we're now, I believe this was the 1700s that they were in at the time. And he goes, imagine what they did to that poor man. And Louis kind of looks at them, and he looks at them differently then. And I think that's the kind of thing that I feel like about vampires. Like, if you became one, just imagine you became one, and you could take out people that were evil, people that were doing horrible things. Would that be such a bad thing? Like, would that be awful? There's a short movie bit in one of the VHS horror movies. I don't know which VHS one it is, but there's a clip and that kind of comes into play. And I really was like, yeah, that's what I'd do in that situation. But alas, it has not come for me. Still, no vampire, nothing. Anyway, let's get back to business. I think that's why vampire stories have endured for centuries. They have let us explore parts of ourselves that ordinary stories don't always let us do. They don't let us reach that fear of death that is innate in many of us, and the desire for connection, the wish to be transformed that many of us have, and the longing to be loved completely for who we are and absolutely accepted for our flaws. One of the things I love about vampire stories is that they tend to grow with us. As children, we see the monster. As teenagers, we see the romance. And as adults, we often start seeing the tragedy. When I think of Louis now, I don't think of simply a vampire. I think of somebody completely wrestling with grief and trying to hold on to his humanity as hard as he can. And he's in a world, and he's stuck in that world that is constantly fighting against him and trying to pull his humanity away. I believe this is why he was so sought after in the film, and he really was. If you notice, many of the main characters, they wanted Louis because of the substance he had. And these are also characters of substance that are in the movie. So, Lestat would find life meaningless without Louis. And he constantly said to Louis, you'd find eternity extremely meaningless without me. But I feel like that was a huge projection. And, that's why their relationship became very codependent and toxic until Claudia came along and kind of switched that up a little bit. But of course, Lestat chose Louis and wanted him to be by his side forever. Claudia called Louis her beloved, her father, her mother. He was constantly being pulled from pillar to post. And then, of course, we have the really kind of, I feel like, and I know this movie you could say is dark overall, but this part is where it gets really dark for me. And the characters are introduced in Paris, and we have all the different parts that they play, but Antonio Banderas' character Armand is one that stands out the most, and he also becomes fascinated by Louis. And when Louis asks Armand does he want him to stay and for Claudia to go, especially as Armand has so many other vampires floating around him, Armand says that they are all useless and they can't reflect anything, which I think is really significant. Reflect as being seen, seeing yourself in someone. I think that is really poignant. But he says that Louis can reflect. And then he also says, you reflect a broken heart. And he finishes with a vampire with a human soul. And Louis has to sit there and kind of absorb that for a minute, because essentially that's exactly who he is. And something, within this story, Into the Vampire, this is extremely rare. A vampire with a human soul that can feel empathy and sympathy for humans. It's very sought after as well. It seems other vampires want to be around that. They crave it. So much so that, like I said, he is pulled from pillar to post. And I believe that that's the same for many of us in real life. And because that's relatable, Louis just doesn't just reflect other characters, he reflects us. As human beings in real life, we seek out something deeper, something other, and more meaning, and someone who can reflect that back to us and understand it, as we go through this life, which, feels like a hot mess 9 times out of 10. Maybe that's just me. But this is exactly what makes the film the blueprint for many other vampire characters who come after Louis and Lestat. Vampires tormented by their pasts that no longer want to take human lives and simply go after animals instead and make that what they are about, And of course, I'm referring to the Cullens there in Twilight. Interview with the Vampire changed the way we looked at vampires. As mentioned earlier, Anne Rice made the vampires a focal point, the protagonists, the antagonists, the anti-hero. Looking at Lestat's character now, I don't just see the charming rogue who enjoys tomfoolery and teasing aristocrats. I see someone who is desperately afraid of being alone for eternity. This is what elevates Interview the Vampire above so many other vampire works of fiction. Even if we took away all the blood and fangs and immortality, the characters would still work, because the emotional struggles that are there are recognisable and relatable to us in real life as viewers or readers. And honestly, I think that's why so many vampire fans remain vampire fans for life, or eternity, you could say. The stories evolve as we do. They change as society changes. They change as time changes. And we find new meanings in them at different stages of our life. As I mentioned before, as a child, we fear them. I mentioned earlier the way I felt about them and how I had these recurring nightmares as well. But as a teenager watching Buffy, and that became my comfort TV program for many, many years, you see the romance, the relationship, and then obviously as it goes on, it becomes something a bit more than romance. But you see all of that, and it grows with you. And then once I became an adult and I watched Interview with a Vampire, you see the tragedy in it, the fact that it's not really actually that romantic at all. I mean, it can be, but it isn't. They did become seductive, beautiful, alluring creatures because of writers like Anne Rice, who actually helped us empathise with them and understand them. Once audiences became able to empathise and sympathise with the vampire, the transformation from monster to lover and romantic anti-hero was almost inevitable, especially for those that already loved vampires. Yet, who knows? There is always the possibility that in another 100 years we shall see the vampire reflect back to us and they will have changed all over again. Maybe gone right back to the start with the likes of Nosferatu. Who knows? But for now, I am going to leave you with that. Sorry for the minor technical difficulties and the change in the weather. I know it was very sunny, and then all of a sudden there was a transformation and the weather transformed with it. But anyway, thank you for joining me today, and thank you for listening. I hope you did enjoy the topic. I'm going to be talking about pretty much anything that I find interesting, that is strange, unusual, spooky, scary, horror movie, anything that kind of falls into those categories. And hopefully this time bigger channels and creators won't kind of take ideas from smaller channels and creators. Not gonna poke any fingers, but yeah, it's been noticeable. Anyway, as a smaller channel, I do say very, very big thank you to those that do watch and do pay attention and do like the videos. I know that over the past 2 years I haven't posted as consistently, but I plan on doing so from now on. And I would like to at least post weekly, and then the plan is to post twice a week. Anyway, until then, be safe, stay spooky, and look after each other, because I love you. Mwah.